We're now in server 02, and the difference is we're importing in some hard-coded data. If we look in here, we have two files for projects, three fields here, students, that actually has a reference to projects by ID, so there's a link between students and projects. So if we come back to server 02, we're importing that data structure, and now we're defining a couple of new queries of students that returns a list of type student, projects that returns a list of type project. We can't have nulls in the list. It can be empty, but it mustn't contain null. That's the exclamation mark, the bang. And in students, it must be of type student, and of projects, it must be of type project. So these aren't scalar types anymore. Once again, we see some definitions, some comments that will appear in our docs, in our playground. And if we look at the type student, it has ID, must have a name, must have a string, and has projects that must return a list. It can't be null, and they should be of type project. So whatever we get in here will conform to the project type. What is a project? GraphQL will ask. Well, a project has an ID, a name, and a completed status, and these must all be defined. An ID can be scalar, can be a string or an integer, it gets serialized, but it's declarative and says actually this is of some importance as an ID. So if we look at our resolvers, we have our query here, we have a students and a projects query. What do they do? If we go to the resolvers, we see students returns a list of all students, projects returns a list of all projects. So let's go into the playground, and if we open up, and if we have a look at the docs to start with, we can see we have students that returns a type student, projects returns project, user details will appear in docs. If we come back into the queries, we can see the user details will appear in docs, and in students ID comments here. We can see those comments, user details appear in docs, and when we go into the ID, we can see ID comments here. That comment that was in here appears there. So if you want to put extra comments that appear in the docs on the playground, that's how we do it. So let's clear that out, refresh, and let's come in here and see if we do control space. We can see we get students. Now if we do this, we get an error, of course, because it says it must have subfields because it's not returning a scalar. So we do this, and now we can see we can get a list of all the different things, list of the IDs. Let's prettify this, come back down. If we do name, and if we do email, we get that, we get those all back, and that corresponds to the data structure that we have here in students. We have three items here, and if we come back here and now say, well, what are their projects, we're going to get an error because it's saying must have subfields. So we put those in. We want to get the ID, the name, and we want to get whether it's completed or not. We do that. Cannot return null, and the reason it comes back as null is because it doesn't know how to resolve these projects. So if we look at the schema, we can see that when we come into the server 02, we can see that it has projects, but down in the resolvers there's no way to resolve what a projects are. So in this instant we can't really do that. We have to find some way in a later lesson where we can resolve these different types. So for now, when we come back here, all we can do is really do a top level query, and we get that back. And if we also want to get a list of projects, we can do projects here again. Again, we must do the subfields, name. They're not going to be related. They're just going to be two sets of queries coming back. There we can see students. And as I say, if we want to kind of basically make my query 1 and give it an alias, we can. My query 2. And if we click on this, we get them all back here. If we click on one here and do Control Enter, we get everything back as well. So there we see these two queries that we can sort of send back. Refresh in here. So what we're seeing here is that if we make our own queries and we define something that's not of a scalar type, we need to define how it comes back, and this becomes a way of sending back more details of information, lists of objects, which will be our standard way with APIs. And we can see that with student, with project, and we're resolving here. And in the next few lessons, what we do is thinking, well, how can we actually return subfields where they're linked? Students and projects are linked at the moment because when we have a student, it contains projects, which is a list of different projects here. So those will be the next few lessons coming up on how to resolve that type of data.